Do you ever find yourself overwhelmed by the amount of injustice and suffering in the world? Maybe it doesn't take the world to overwhelm you. Maybe you're just overwhelmed by the amount of injustice and suffering in your own experience. Right? But what I find is that all of us have deep inside of us this ache for the world to be a different place. My hunch is that we've been shaped to think about social change in a way that makes it almost impossible for social change to occur. In America, we've been shaped to think about social change in a very particular way. First, all social change has to be systemic. We have to think about change at this level, as large and as dynamic and as impressive as can possibly be. And once we've decided what that systemic change must be, we have to find that visionary leader who can bring us to that promised land of this world that we want so badly. Then we come to this place where this argument must always be a zero-sum game. This vision that we have and this person who will bring us there, if we don't win, the world as we hope for it to be will either never arrive or it will be taken from us. So the stakes are always the ultimate. And finally, those who do happen to win, we repeat this message. What we have done, or what I have done, the visionary leader will say, you too can do. We see this all the time in presidential campaigns. Right, in 2008, President Barack Obama runs by saying, change we can believe in. Right, in 2016, make America great again. These are these systemic changes by a visionary leader in a zero-sum game. And if you get on board, you too can make the world as you want it to be. But what happens is this doesn't bring change. In the 2016 election, given two different choices, incommensurate choices, between two visions of the change of our society, the winner of this election is no one. It's paralysis. 102 million people chose nothing. Not to mention all the people who just voted against the other vision. So what do? We chip in $20, we throw the right hashtag on our social media to express our frustration, and we have drinks with our friends who agree with us and lament that the world is not different. But what we don't find is that change ever comes. We're trapped in a reality that we did not choose and that we cannot escape. And this brings us to a story in London. In the year 2000, the Millennium Bridge was opened to celebrate the dawn of a new era. We have finally achieved a new season in the world, in the history of humankind. And this bridge that had been built to celebrate this moment opens to great fanfare and to massive crowds. This is a moment that I will participate in history, these people say. And as the footbridge begins to fill with more and more people, it doesn't take long to realize that something is fundamentally wrong. You see, the bridge is made to absorb the energy of the pedestrians. It's made to absorb the energy of foot by foot, person by person, but this bridge is more full than it should be. And all of a sudden, a bridge that is designed to absorb energy begins to produce it. And what begins as a comfortable stroll becomes an awkward waddle. And suddenly it becomes a march of people moving in the same direction over and over, simply attempting not to fall. People are injured. The bridge is closed for 2 years. This has been an utter disaster which no one on the bridge can escape. This is how it feels sometimes in the society in which we live. The world moves without us, without our permission, and does things that we are powerless to stop. Just think about how this works in the real world. 26 people in the world own as much money as the poorest half of the world. 68.5 million people are forcibly displaced in the world. 2.3 billion people live without access to clean water. Climate change will reach that critical 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2052, in which our environment will experience chaos, some say as soon as 2030. And if this isn't overwhelming enough, we can think a little closer to home. 1 in 10 school-age children in New York City is homeless. That's 144,000 children. More homeless children today in New York City than during the Great Depression. We can think about how every 98 seconds in the United States, someone is a victim of sexual assault, and that less than 0.5% of those people will ever be charged and punished. We can think about how in 2017, student debt reached $1.5 trillion, how it's disproportionately borne by women, and its rate of delinquency is increasing day after day, becoming both a threat to our own lives and to our economy. Or for the second consecutive year, we can think about the way that the number of uninsured Americans in America has risen to almost 14%, or 44 million people. We haven't even touched on a whole host of issues like mass incarceration or the abuse of children, and we haven't talked about homophobia or hate crimes, right? There are all kinds of things that we just can't seem to escape. And sometimes our heroes say these things too. We hear them this way because of the way we've been taught to think about change. They say, what I have done, you can do. Oh yeah, I can be a Nelson Mandela, or a Malala, Einstein, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King, no problem. Probably next week though, right? No, but we're taught to hear our heroes in a way that only raises that paralysis that we feel about social change. Think about the bridge again. The only way in which the momentum of the bridge in London was ever going to be challenged was not to have a reactionary move. When the bridge goes left, I go right. It wouldn't have worked that way. The only way in which the bridge was going to stop is if you chose to quit moving. If you chose to no longer cooperate with the momentum that was being placed upon you. And it wasn't that one person stopping moving was going to change everything. It was that one person had to stop and invite another person to stop, who would call another to stop. And as that began to spread through the bridge, there was the capacity for a different kind of momentum to emerge. You see, it's not our job to change the entire world by ourselves. This is the mistake we make. We think that the entire world must be the visionary. We all must be the next great activist, the next Nobel laureate, the next New York Times bestseller. But the reality is that the world changes not by the visionary, but by the interrupter. When you think about the civil rights movement, we know the faces that are always in the front. We know the names and the lives and the speeches and the writings. But what we know is that without all the other people, nothing would have taken place. And we see this over and over again in other movements. We see this in the Women's March of recent. We see this in Black Lives Matter. We see this in all movements, that we have the visionary which the culture celebrates and longs for, but it is the interrupters that make things happen. Now, there are an infinite number of places in our society in which interruption needs to take place. But I want to invite you into a place that I believe is an exponential location for social change, and that is to become an interrupter for children. You see, childhood trauma and adversity is a leading factor in all kinds of problems throughout our society. Addiction, mass incarceration, homelessness, mental health, suicide, poverty, educational outcomes, they're all tied to the challenges and to the adversity and to the trauma that are faced by children. And in fact, most of us in this room know this firsthand. This is the other myth, that this doesn't happen to very many people. The reality is this is most of us. Here's just a couple examples of that impact. In 2017, the state of Tennessee did a study in which they studied the loss of workplace productivity and negative health outcomes that are directly tied to adverse childhood experiences. In 1 year, it cost the state of Tennessee $5.2 billion in their economy. The World Health Organization reports that due to anxiety and depression, which are largely rooted in childhood trauma, cost the global economy $1 trillion a year. Or there's extensive literature about the higher rate of childhood trauma, the more likely that someone gets caught up into the juvenile justice system, which of course feeds the cradle-to-prison pipeline and the questions and the problems that we have with mass incarceration. And there are so many other ways in which the harm of children misshapes our world. But we don't have to be paralyzed by these false visions of social change that we all have to become the visionary. We don't have to be paralyzed by the expectation that we are the one to save the world. We each have the capacity to interrupt for children. We each have the capacity to interrupt abuse and neglect. We have the capacity to interrupt our legislators. We have the capacity to interrupt our economy. We have the capacity to interrupt whatever industry you are studying to enter. You have the capacity to use your influence and your expertise and your resources to make the world better for children. And in doing so, you always make the world better for the rest of us. You see, a world that's good for adults is not necessarily good for children. But a world that is good for children is good for everyone. So I want to invite you to surrender these outdated visions of social change that keep us in the mess that we're in. I want to invite you into a vision that says, I can and I will do anything that I can for the most vulnerable among us. And then I want to invite you to join a movement of people throughout history whose names we don't know and stories we cannot tell, but whose difference cannot be quantified. I want to welcome you and invite you into being an interrupter. So join me in the revolution. Thank you.